The Ozark Hills of Missouri, in the years after the Civil War, were a place of silence broken only by the cry of whippoorwills and the low rustle of wind through endless trees. Travelers passing along the dirt trails often spoke of the beauty of the land, of its steep ridges, shadowed valleys, and springs that seemed to pour out from stone itself. Yet beneath the stillness, beneath the tall oaks and limestone bluffs, something darker waited. It was said that men disappeared here, that wagons rolled down the road but never arrived at their destination. Whispers followed the paths just as surely as hoofprints in the mud. Whispers of two brothers who greeted travelers with smiles, only to lead them into a silence from which no voice returned. Their names were never carved into stone with honor, but they linger in folklore, muttered at campfires and in faded newsprint that has yellowed with time. They were not outlaws in the flamboyant sense of Jesse James, nor soldiers remembered for their loyalty. They were innkeepers, or so they called themselves, men who offered shelter, food, and the illusion of safety in a land where danger seemed to come from every hollow. But as the stories go, their home became a grave for many, a place where the weary found not rest, but a brutal end. Imagine yourself as a traveler then, the year 1867. The war is over, but its scars still shape the countryside. Bands of raiders still prowl. Food is scarce, roads uncertain. You come across a modest house on the edge of a lonely trail, lanterns glowing, smoke curling from a chimney. Two brothers stand waiting, their voices friendly, their manner calm. Relief floods through you. Here, perhaps, you will eat, sleep, and wake to continue the journey. Yet, unknown to you, the very table where you will sit has been wiped clean, not only of supper's crumbs, but of another kind of stain. The stories are chilling in their repetition. A knock at the door, a warm welcome, the serving of food and drink. Then, a sudden strike, a hammer, an axe, a knife. Sometimes a trap door, opening without warning, plunging the guest into darkness below. Victims vanished into the earth, hidden in shallow graves or beneath floors, their possessions quietly divided, their names erased by silence. What remained was the echo of their absence, the unanswered letters, the wagons left abandoned by the side of the road. Even in their own time, locals whispered of a curse upon the brothers' land. Some believed it was greed that drove them, others that the war had carved out their souls and left only hunger for blood. There were accounts fragile, contradictory, of men who survived an encounter, who felt the brothers' eyes linger too long, their smiles too sharp, their voices too measured. But most who crossed that threshold did not live to share their suspicions. This is not merely the story of two violent men, but of a community gripped by unease. For in the Ozarks, isolation was both shield and prison. Neighbors lived miles apart, news traveled slowly, and rumors filled the spaces left by silence. When a traveler disappeared, was it Indians? Bandits? Or was it something closer? Something uncomfortably domestic, a hearth that burned not to warm but to conceal? By 1867, the brothers' deeds had etched themselves into the whispered geography of the region. Even children spoke their names in hushed tones, dared each other to pass their house after nightfall. The press, when it finally caught wind, fed on the story with fascination, calling them monsters, demons in human shape. Yet the quiet dread in the countryside was far older than the printed word. People already knew. They had seen too many disappear. This tale, then, is not just about blood spilled in the dark, but about the human hunger for safety, for hospitality, and how that hunger can be twisted into a trap. The brothers understood the vulnerability of the road-weary, the fear of the wild night. They cloaked themselves in kindness, and in that kindness, they found their weapon. Tonight, we reopen their story. We walk again down those dirt trails where travelers once rode with weary hope. We step across the threshold of the brothers' house, where the air is heavy with smoke and something sour beneath it. We sit at the table, hear the scrape of plates, the faint clatter of knives, and we know, with the weight of history pressing on us, that not every guest who sat there would stand again. Their tale has become part folklore, part fact, woven into the dark fabric of Missouri's history. Some deny it happened at all, dismissing it as the invention of fearful minds in a violent age. Others insist the graves remain hidden beneath roots and stone. Whether exaggerated or true, the story clings to the land, shaping the way we remember the Ozarks, not just as a place of natural beauty, but as a place where the promise of rest turned to terror. And so, as we begin this journey into the shadows of 1867 Missouri, we must keep one question in mind. When the night falls and strangers offer you comfort, do you truly know what waits behind their smile? To understand the unsettling story of the brothers in the Missouri Ozarks, we must first step back into the social and cultural landscape of the mid-19th century United States. The year was 1867, just 2 years after the end of the Civil War. The nation was scarred and fragile, its wounds still bleeding in ways both visible and unseen. Missouri, caught between Union and Confederate sympathies, had been a land of divided loyalties, where families sometimes found themselves on opposite sides of battle lines. The war left not only graves scattered across fields, but also bitterness, distrust, and violence simmering in rural communities. The Ozark region, stretching across southern Missouri into Arkansas, was isolated by its geography. Hills rolled in, waves of stone and timber, streams cut narrow valleys, and ridges towered over winding trails that were often impassable in poor weather. This isolation meant that small communities had to be self-reliant. Towns were few and far between, and farms dotted the ridges and scattered patches. Most families lived far from one another, bound together not by bustling towns but by fragile threads of necessity. News traveled slowly, carried by riders or word of mouth, and suspicion grew easily in a place where silence was the rule of life. In 1867, travel through the Ozarks was a dangerous proposition. The roads were little more than rutted dirt paths, sometimes vanishing into wilderness without clear direction. Wagons broke down, horses tired, and storms could turn trails into rivers of mud. For travelers, the promise of shelter was more than convenience, it was survival. Inns, boarding houses, and farmhouses that offered rest to strangers became critical lifelines. Yet that dependency carried with it a deep vulnerability. To step into a stranger's home, to entrust one's safety to their hospitality required faith. And faith was not always rewarded. Missouri at this time was in economic turmoil. The war had devastated farms, destroyed supply lines, and left many families in poverty. Soldiers returning home often found their land ruined, their families displaced, and their futures uncertain. Banditry and violence were not uncommon. Outlaw gangs roamed the back roads, seizing what they could. The James Younger gang would rise to infamy not long after, drawing from the same climate of unrest and lawlessness. In such a world, moral boundaries blurred. Men accustomed to bloodshed could carry that violence into civilian life. The line between farmer, innkeeper, and outlaw was thin, sometimes invisible. Culturally, the Ozarks carried a mix of traditions. Settlers had come from Appalachia, the South, and parts of Europe, bringing with them folklore, superstitions, and a deep suspicion of outsiders. Stories of witches, curses, and hauntings mingled with the daily hardships of rural survival. These traditions shaped how people interpreted tragedy. A missing traveler might be blamed on spirits of the woods, on cursed land, or on the wrath of God. This climate of superstition provided fertile soil for legends to grow, even as real dangers, bandits, violence, and hunger loomed in more practical forms. The farmhouse of the brothers fit seamlessly into this environment. From the outside, it appeared ordinary, a place of rest on a lonely road, built in the manner of countless others, with rough timber walls and a roof patched from storms. Yet within, according to rumor, it became a place where the darker side of survival was enacted. The family presented themselves as hospitable figures, offering food and beds to the weary. But the truth whispered by locals was that their hospitality concealed a hunger for profit, and perhaps for something far more disturbing. Historically, the concept of murder inns is not unique to Missouri. Across the world, isolated roadside inns have carried dark reputations. In France, the 19th century tale of the Auberge Rouge spoke of innkeepers who lured travelers to their deaths for gold. In England, folklore told of the Red Barn murders. In America, Stories of treacherous inns found their way into dime novels and campfire tales, warning travelers to be wary of too-good-to-be-true kindness. The brothers in Missouri became the American echo of this phenomenon, their story shaped by the isolation of the Ozarks and the uncertainty of Reconstruction era life. Law enforcement in the region was weak at best. Sheriffs were few, courts were distant, and many crimes went unreported or unsolved. A missing traveler could easily vanish into the silence of the hills, his fate never fully explained. Families who waited for loved ones to return from journeys westward often received no answers, only silence. Some of those disappearances, folklore insists, can be traced to the farmhouse on that lonely trail. With each new rumor, fear deepened, and yet little was done. Perhaps people feared the truth. Perhaps they preferred to tell themselves the missing had simply gone astray, fallen victim to bandits, or wandered into the wilderness. To accuse neighbors was dangerous. In a world where survival depended on fragile cooperation, suspicion could tear apart what little unity remained. The post-war Ozarks were also a place of shifting identities. Some men had fought as Unionists, others as Confederates, and some as bushwhackers, guerrilla fighters who lived by their own rules, killing, raiding, and vanishing into the woods. Many bushwhackers never abandoned that life. When the war ended, they simply continued their violence under new disguises. It is not impossible that the brothers' descent into murder was rooted in that background, their brutality shaped by years of lawless conflict. The war did not end for everyone in 1865. For some, it simply took on new forms. From a social perspective, hospitality itself carried a dual nature in the 19th century. On one hand, it was a sacred duty. Strangers were often welcomed with food, shelter, and kindness, especially in isolated rural regions. On the other, it was a practical transaction. Travelers might pay with money, goods, or labor. The brothers exploited both sides of this tradition. They offered the appearance of kindness, but behind that kindness was calculation. Each weary traveler represented not a guest, but an opportunity, a chance to rob, to kill, and to enrich themselves at the expense of another's life. By the time whispers of their deeds began to spread beyond the Ozarks, the brothers had already become figures of dread. Whether every story was true or whether folklore exaggerated their crimes is difficult to know. But the fear they inspired reflects the anxieties of their age. Fear of strangers, fear of isolation, fear that even in moments of supposed safety, death could be waiting just beyond the door, and this fear was not limited to Missouri. Across America, as the nation struggled to rebuild, stories of hidden dangers seemed to flourish. The Reconstruction years were filled with tales of crime, betrayal, and lurking evil. The brothers' story became one thread in that larger tapestry, a reminder that the war may have ended, but peace was fragile, and the line between survival and savagery was perilously thin. It is within this backdrop of war-torn communities, fragile economies, superstition, and lawlessness that the brothers' farmhouse takes on its darkest meaning. To the weary traveler, it was a light in the wilderness. To those who knew better, it was a place where the light itself concealed the shadows. The Missouri Ozarks in 1867 were not just a landscape of hills and hollows. They were a landscape of fear, of silence, and of secrets too dark to remain buried forever. The first accounts that reached neighboring settlements were fragmented, whispered, and tinged with disbelief. A wagoner named Elijah Thompson, returning from a trade route, spoke of a night when he saw lights in a farmhouse far off the beaten path. From the dim glow of lanterns, shadows moved with unsettling precision. He recalled how the doors opened before he knocked, as if anticipating his arrival, and two men greeted him with a cordiality that belied the chill creeping down his spine. He took the offered food and rested his horse, yet sleep was uneasy. He awoke to a soft creak outside his room, a step he had not expected. The wind carried no sound but the faint murmur of conversation, and he left before dawn, sensing an invisible weight pressing on him. Others did not leave at all. In the months that followed, stories became more direct and harrowing. Travelers who ventured into the hills reported minor injuries that hinted at far worse. A man named Silas Wren recounted a sudden fall while approaching the farmhouse porch. His ankle twisted painfully, and when he attempted to call for help, a shadow appeared at the window, watching him with unnerving patience. The brothers emerged to assist, offering his aid as though it were a lifeline, but the tension in the air betrayed their intentions. Neighbors later described finding Wren wandering the hills days later, half delirious, unable to recount the full events without stammering. His possessions were scattered, a clear indication of robbery, yet the deeper horrors remained unspoken. Then there was the case of the Weathers family, heading west in search of farmland. They came upon the same farmhouse, its lanterns warm against the approaching night. The brothers welcomed them, insisted they stay for dinner. The family, weary and trusting, sat at the rough-hewn table. Drinks were poured, plates served, and the meal began with the routine pleasantries of hospitality. But when the night deepened, so too did the unease. The eldest son noted a trapdoor beneath the floorboards, half concealed, yet none dared to speak. Later accounts suggest that the family awoke in a different room, chained and disoriented, the farmhouse walls echoing with silence. They survived, though traumatized, and their descriptions of the brothers' meticulous cruelty spread slowly through the county. Another incident involved a lone blacksmith, carrying tools to a neighboring settlement. He described the dining room, lined with rustic furniture and shelves stacked with common goods, a scene of mundane normality. Yet subtle details betrayed something more sinister. A collection of knives polished to a mirror finish, floorboards, suspiciously reinforced, and faint scratches that did not belong. When offered a room for the night, he accepted, only to wake to the faint sound of breathing nearby, a presence without a figure. His instinct was flight. He escaped before dawn, the horror of realization following him like a shadow. These episodes, multiplied, each more terrifying than the last. Some travelers were never seen again. Search parties found only abandoned wagons, scattered personal effects, and footprints leading into the forest, as if the victims had been swallowed by the earth. Livestock would go missing. The occasional scream pierced the night, leaving neighbors sleepless and suspicious. When investigators finally arrived months later, the farmhouse seemed ordinary from the outside, its exterior calm and unchanged. Inside, signs of violence lingered faintly. Bloodstains scrubbed but not erased, scratches on wooden walls, faint echoes of the events that had transpired. The brothers' methods varied with opportunity. Some accounts suggest that poison was administered in meals, subtle and untraceable, leaving victims weakened before the final blow. Others describe direct attacks with axes, hammers, and knives, each strike calculated and deliberate. The brutality was methodical. The brothers seemed to understand fear as a tool, prolonging terror to amplify their control. In several cases, travelers described being restrained, tied to chairs, or hidden within storage rooms, the hours stretching endlessly before an attack or release. Every incident left a mark on the psyche of survivors, and the word of mouth created a web of anxiety that expanded across the Ozarks. Even within the local community, the brothers' presence cast a long shadow. Neighbors recalled seeing unusual lights flickering late at night, or hearing sounds of struggle that they attributed to livestock or the wind. Those who dared to confront them reported calm, polite denials, smiles that never reached the eyes. The facade of normalcy was deliberate, a mask over horror. Letters found later, preserved in local records, describe attempts to warn authorities, but the reports were dismissed or delayed. Corruption, distance, and disbelief all conspired to allow the brothers' spree to continue undisturbed. Over time, the brothers' infamy grew. The most chilling stories came from those who survived moments of direct confrontation. One man recalled being led to a cellar-like room, the air thick and cool. He felt the weight of a hidden presence, smelled the faint iron tang of blood, and heard the deliberate scraping of wood on stone. The brothers' movements were quiet, yet every step was purposeful, every gesture measured. The survivor's account concluded with an almost cinematic escape, a leap through a back window, rolling into the mud and fleeing until the farmhouse was nothing more than a distant silhouette against the moonlit hills. Every incident deepened the community's unease. Farmers began traveling in groups, wagons were equipped with improvised weapons, and nights were spent in fear of the unknown. Rumors proliferated. The brothers were believed to have accomplices, secret rooms, even hidden passages connecting them to the hills themselves. Some locals theorized supernatural elements, a suggestion rooted not in credulity, but in the overwhelming terror of unexplainable disappearances. The brothers themselves never spoke of their motives, and in the rare confrontations, their calm demeanors only amplified the fear. As more travelers vanished or escaped, the brothers' pattern emerged with grim clarity. Each approach was carefully staged, a welcoming facade, a meal, a room, a trap, a disappearance. The combination of ordinary domesticity and sudden violence created an almost unbearable tension for those who stumbled upon it. Even today, historians note the psychological precision behind their crimes. The use of anticipation, the exploitation of trust, and the meticulous concealment of bodies all suggest a cold, calculated intelligence behind acts that otherwise might appear chaotic or frenzied. Ultimately, the incidents in the Missouri Ozarks became a tapestry of terror, stitched together by fear, rumor, and the occasional surviving testimony. Each story is more than a crime. It is an entry point into the fraught landscape of post-war America, where isolation, distrust, and the legacy of violence intersected. The farmhouse was no longer just a building. It became a symbol, a locus where the vulnerabilities of humanity met the predatory nature of those who understood them too well. Travelers carried the memory of the hills not for their natural beauty, but for the calculated menace lurking behind welcoming doors. In recounting these events, one sees the duality of human experience, the desire for shelter and sustenance, met with a predatory cunning that perverts trust into terror. The incidents, detailed and numerous, capture both the horror of what was done and the fragility of those who survived. The brothers' actions were not impulsive, but methodical, a testament to how isolation, opportunity, and a deep understanding of human psychology can combine to create horrors that echo far beyond their time. By the end of this series of incidents, the Ozarks had become a landscape of fear. Stories spread like wildfire, and travelers learned to approach with caution. Every creaking floorboard, every flickering lantern, every whisper of wind through the trees could signal danger. The brothers' legacy, embedded in the hills and the minds of those who heard the tales, remained long after the events themselves faded into history. The revelation of the brothers' deeds did not immediately spread beyond the narrow hills of the Ozarks. Locals, long accustomed to isolation and hardship, were hesitant to speak openly. The fear of retaliation, combined with a deep-seated suspicion of outsiders, created a veil of silence over the community. Those who had encountered the brothers or survived their attacks often described the reactions of neighbors as cautious and wary. Conversations were held in whispers, in corners of fields, or beneath the shadows of barns. Families exchanged warnings, yet few dared to intervene directly. Fear, like fog, hung over the landscape. Neighbors recounted subtle signs that something was amiss. Livestock disappearing, doors left unlocked but rooms eerily empty, the soft glow of lanterns moving behind curtained windows long after nightfall. When residents attempted to report these anomalies, law enforcement was slow to respond. Sheriffs were overwhelmed, often traveling from distant towns along treacherous paths, and the jurisdictional reach in the Ozarks was limited. Letters sent to county officials would sometimes arrive weeks later, their urgency lost in the delay. By the time authorities could act, the brothers had already moved on to their next calculated act. Local newspapers, when they eventually covered the events, oscillated between disbelief and sensationalism. Headlines spoke vaguely of vanishing travelers or unexplained disappearances, leaving out explicit accusations. Reporters struggled with the balance between credibility and horror, wary of spreading unverified rumors yet compelled by the growing whispers. Articles framed the incidents in the context of regional dangers, wild animals, rough terrain, and remnants of post-war lawlessness. However, the most terrifying accounts came from letters, diary entries, and word-of-mouth testimony, which conveyed details too chilling for the printed page, yet too compelling to ignore. Family members of victims, when able to share their experiences, expressed a mix of horror, disbelief, and guilt. They wrestled with questions of trust. Why had their loved ones accepted hospitality? And could they have predicted the danger? Survivors often relived their encounters through vivid recollection, describing not only the physical threats but the psychological manipulation employed by the brothers. Fear became a pervasive social force, shaping daily decisions and interactions. Travel along the isolated trails was accompanied by rituals of caution, keeping companions nearby, carrying makeshift weapons, or avoiding nightfall entirely. Religious. Leaders in the area interpreted the events through the lens of morality and divine justice. Some pastors delivered sermons warning of human wickedness, framing the brothers' actions as evidence of spiritual corruption in the world. Others emphasized the resilience of the community, urging vigilance and prayer, but avoiding sensational details that could incite panic. These perspectives reinforced the social understanding that danger was not only external, but often close to home, hidden behind the facade of normalcy. Scientific and medical interpretations were, by today's standards, rudimentary but revealing. Local physicians speculated about the psychological state of the brothers, describing tendencies toward what they termed moral insanity. Scholars of the time considered their actions as anomalies arising from the isolation of frontier life, the trauma of war, and the lack of social oversight. While lacking modern terminology, these observations recognized a pattern. Violence, cruelty, and manipulation were not random, but rooted in a particular environment and social context. These insights were shared sparingly, usually in correspondence, between professionals, but they contributed to a broader understanding of the nexus between environment, psychology, and criminal behavior. Community meetings were held sporadically to discuss strategies for safety. Groups of men organized patrols, occasionally venturing near the farmhouse to observe without confrontation. These meetings reflected a mixture of bravery and superstition. The Ozark residents combined practical measures with traditional beliefs, invoking protective symbols or sharing tales of the past to prepare for potential encounters. Women, though less frequently recorded in historical texts, played a critical role in maintaining household vigilance and transmitting warnings. Oral histories indicate that mothers and daughters carried knowledge of which roads to avoid and which inns were trustworthy, passing these lessons to successive generations. Despite growing awareness, complete intervention was challenging. The brothers' ability to blend into the environment, coupled with the vast rugged terrain, made tracking them difficult. Hunters, travelers, and law enforcement who attempted to follow trails often became disoriented. Survival instincts, combined with the inherent unpredictability of the Ozark Hills, allowed the brothers to evade capture for extended periods. Their presence became a cautionary tale, embedding itself into the local consciousness and folklore. Legends grew around the farmhouse, exaggerating both the brothers' cunning and the dangers of venturing alone. Letters preserved in county archives show a mix of frustration and fear. Citizens pleaded for stricter enforcement, offering personal observations, sketches of the farmhouse, and detailed accounts of suspicious activities. Authorities often responded slowly, constrained by limited resources and the logistical challenges of the terrain. By the time law enforcement could investigate, the brothers were either gone or had meticulously erased traces of their presence. The tension between urgent reports and slow response highlighted systemic vulnerabilities, underscoring how isolation and social fragmentation could exacerbate the consequences of criminal behavior. The broader regional community, beyond the immediate Ozarks, eventually heard fragmented tales of the brothers' deeds. Storytellers, traveling merchants, and returning veterans carried the accounts to neighboring counties and states. These retellings blended fact with embellishment, creating narratives that merged historical events with the dramatic flair of frontier folklore. Over time, the brothers' story became a symbol of the dangers that lurked in remote America, where the line between hospitality and threat, safety and peril, could be perilously thin. Even as time passed, the psychological impact on the community endured. Generations of travelers remembered the warnings, and local children were told stories of the farmhouse as a cautionary lesson. Scholars examining the period note that the cultural memory of the Ozarks during the Reconstruction era is colored by these events. Fear, superstition, and tales of violence became integral to the identity of the region. The brothers' legacy was thus both literal and symbolic, a warning about human cruelty and the fragility of social bonds in isolated post-war landscapes. Ultimately, the reaction of society to the brothers' crimes was multifaceted. It encompassed terror and disbelief, practical measures for survival, moral contemplation, and the birth of folklore. Individuals navigated these experiences through personal vigilance, communal strategies, religious frameworks, and emerging psychological interpretations. The farmhouse was more than a physical location. It was a nexus of fear, shaping human behavior and social structures long after the immediate events faded from memory. In the Ozarks, the shadow of the brothers lingered, a haunting reminder that evil often wears the guise of hospitality, and that the landscape itself can become complicit in concealing horrors too terrible to face directly. The night had fallen heavier than usual, pressing down upon the Ozark hills with an almost tangible weight. Mist clung to the forest floor, curling around gnarled roots and skeletal branches. The farmhouse stood as it always did, rustic, innocuous, from the road, yet pulsating with a quiet menace that only those who had ventured near could sense. That evening, a traveler named Jonathan Reed approached, unaware that this night would test every instinct he possessed. His horse moved cautiously, ears twitching at each sound, and Reed could feel the oppressive darkness pressing in, a prelude to what awaited. As he neared the farmhouse, the lanterns inside flickered, casting shifting shadows that seemed almost alive. The brothers appeared at the doorway with their familiar polite smiles, hands outstretched in greeting, welcoming Reed as though he were merely another weary soul seeking shelter. The facade was flawless. Their hospitality appeared genuine. Reed, though wary, accepted their offer of warmth and food. He felt the faintest twinge of dread, yet dismissed it, trusting perhaps in his own judgment, a mistake he would soon regret. Dinner was served in a room lined with the trappings of domestic life: wooden tables, plates of food, shelves with jars of preserved goods. The conversation was mundane, the warmth of the hearth reassuring. But the air was heavy, laden with an unspoken tension. Reed noticed small details: scratches on the floorboards, the deliberate placement of furniture, the faint metallic scent that seemed out of place. His heart rate quickened, an unacknowledged signal of danger that he was too polite to acknowledge. The brothers' movements were deliberate, measured. Every gesture carried the weight of premeditated intent. After the meal, Reed was shown to a guest room. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and silence enveloped the space. Minutes stretched into hours. Shadows shifted unnaturally across the walls. The faint creak of floorboards hinted at presence elsewhere, movement unseen yet deeply felt. Reed sensed he was being watched, every corner harboring unseen eyes. Then came the sound, a low, deliberate step outside the door. Reed's instincts screamed danger. He strained to hear, but the silence returned, heavier than before, suffocating in its intensity. He realized that the night was no longer a passage of rest. It had become a labyrinth of psychological terror. Suddenly, the door burst open, and one of the brothers entered, calm but commanding. Reed attempted to react, but the second brother blocked his path, their combined presence overpowering. The room, once familiar, transformed into a stage of imminent violence. Reed's vision sharpened, every detail of the environment imprinted on his mind: the texture of the wooden floor, the faint pattern of light through the curtains, the subtle gleam of the knife held casually in hand. The brothers moved with an unnerving rhythm, each step deliberate, choreographed. Fear became a tangible entity, pressing against Reed's chest, dictating his every heartbeat. They restrained him with efficiency, binding his wrists with rope that had been hidden in the room. Reed struggled, but the brothers' grip was unyielding. Every movement, every breath was monitored. The room seemed to shrink, walls closing in as the atmosphere thickened with anticipation. Time itself became distorted. Minutes elongated, the air growing heavier with each passing second. Reed could hear faint whispers, or perhaps the wind itself carrying imagined voices. The psychological weight was immense, a masterful orchestration of terror designed to break resolve before any physical harm occurred. Then came the revelation of their preparation. Reed noticed a trapdoor partially concealed beneath the rug. The brothers moved with precision, lifting it to reveal the darkness below. The cellar exuded cold and damp, a stark contrast to the warmth above. Reed's mind raced. The realization of his vulnerability sent a shock of adrenaline through his body. He understood with chilling clarity that his survival depended not on force, but on cunning, patience, and the faintest chance of exploiting human error. The brothers, however, were masters of anticipation. Every thought he had seemed to be read, every hesitation predicted, every movement countered. The confrontation escalated into a tense standoff. Reed's attempts to negotiate, to reason, were met with calm indifference. The brothers' eyes, cold and calculating, betrayed no emotion, yet their presence radiated control. The room became a crucible of psychological strain. Sweat beaded on Reed's forehead. Breaths came in shallow, rapid succession, and the faint scent of iron blood or premonition hung in the air. Each passing moment stretched endlessly, the anticipation of violence more harrowing than violence itself. The brothers' understanding of fear was exquisite. They knew that terror, prolonged and unrelenting, could erode resolve as effectively as any blade. At the crescendo, Reed seized a fleeting distraction, a momentary shift in attention, as one brother reached for a misplaced tool. With lightning reflexes, he threw himself toward the door, twisting and rolling across the floor. The brothers reacted instantly, but the momentum, combined with the element of surprise, allowed him to escape into the hall. The farmhouse, once a haven, transformed into a gauntlet. Reed dodged, ducked, and sprinted, the floorboards creaking ominously beneath him, shadows stretching and shifting with his every movement. The brothers pursued with measured precision, yet he clung to instinct and desperation, propelled by the raw will to survive. Outside, the fog enveloped him, concealing his flight among trees and rocks. The night was silent save for his ragged breaths and the occasional scrape of underbrush. He glimpsed the farmhouse from a distance, its windows dark, its doors closed, a silent predator watching. Reed's escape was narrow, every step carried the weight of mortality. The pursuit was not relentless, yet the tension remained, the psychological impression indelible. The brothers' presence, whether real or imagined in the fleeing mind of Reed, persisted as an omnipresent threat. The climax was not a singular act of violence, but a sustained orchestration of terror. Reed's survival depended on intuition, courage, and an acute understanding of the environment. The farmhouse, the brothers, and the surrounding hills were instruments in a complex dance of fear. Every creak, shadow, and gust of wind contributed to the atmosphere of dread. By dawn, Reed had escaped, but the night's events left an indelible mark, a narrative of horror that would echo in his memories for a lifetime. This event, meticulously documented in survivor accounts and subsequent investigations, revealed the brothers' methods in stark relief: patience, anticipation, manipulation of environment, and psychological mastery. They were not merely violent, they were architects of terror, exploiting both human vulnerability and the isolation of the Ozarks. The climax of Reed's encounter crystallized the terrifying precision with which the brothers operated, leaving survivors, neighbors, and authorities alike to grapple with the enormity of what had transpired. It was a night that defined their legend, embedding it permanently in the dark folklore of the Missouri Ozarks. In the years that followed, the farmhouse in the Missouri Ozarks remained an ominous silhouette against the horizon, a structure steeped in legend and fear. Locals avoided the winding paths that led to it, and travelers passing through recounted the same uneasy feeling and inexplicable chill, a sense that the hills themselves were watching. The brothers, whose actions had left an indelible mark on the region, seemed to vanish as mysteriously as they had operated, leaving behind only stories, rumors, and occasional, unsettling signs of their lingering presence. Survivors like Jonathan, Reed carried the psychological scars of that fateful night for the remainder of their lives. Their recollections, often fragmented and tinged with disbelief, became part of the oral history of the Ozarks. Reed's accounts, passed down in letters and diaries, portrayed the brothers not merely as violent criminals, but as masters of fear, men who understood the architecture of terror with unnerving clarity. This understanding of the human mind, of isolation, of the ways in which silence and shadow could be weaponized, elevated their story from mere crime to a cautionary tale about human vulnerability in the wilderness. Despite sporadic attempts at formal investigation, law enforcement struggled to piece together a complete account. The terrain, the brothers' cunning, and the local community's reticence created a near impenetrable veil of mystery. Some historians speculate that the brothers eventually left the Ozarks, blending into other communities or fading into obscurity, while others suggest darker possibilities, that they met a violent end at the hands of someone who had finally deciphered their methods. No definitive records confirm their fate, and the absence of closure has perpetuated a sense of unresolved tension in regional folklore. The farmhouse itself became emblematic of the intersection between human depravity and environmental isolation. Scholars analyzing the period have noted how frontier life in post-Civil War America created circumstances where lawlessness could thrive. Sparse populations, difficult terrain, and limited communication networks all contributed to environments in which predators could operate with impunity. The story of the brothers serves as a lens through which historians examine not only criminal psychology, but also the socio-cultural conditions that enable such behavior. Local legend and folklore further amplified the brothers' notoriety. Tales of mysterious lights, sudden disappearances, and the faint echo of voices in the hills circulated for generations. Some accounts suggest that on certain fog-laden nights, travelers reported glimpses of figures in the windows of the abandoned farmhouse or heard the creak of floorboards where no living soul stood. While these stories are often dismissed as superstition, they reveal the deep psychological imprint the brothers left on collective memory. Fear had become inseparable from place, a haunting that persisted long after direct encounters had ended. 3. Psychological impact extended beyond mere legend. Families living in the vicinity altered their daily routines, imposing self-imposed curfews and warning children to stay close to home. Scholars of American folklore and social psychology have observed that these behaviors are consistent with communities internalizing trauma through narrative. In this sense, the brothers' influence continued to shape the social fabric, demonstrating the long-term effects of fear and violence on human behavior. The farmhouse, the hills, and the stories they generated functioned as both a cautionary tale and a repository of collective memory, ensuring that the events would not be forgotten. The ambiguity surrounding the brothers' ultimate fate invites speculation. Were they ever brought to justice, or did they escape entirely? Did they continue their predatory behaviors elsewhere, leaving other regions to wrestle with similar horrors? Historians and investigators can only piece together fragments, journal entries, second-hand accounts, and local folklore. The lack of resolution adds a layer of enduring suspense, transforming the narrative from a historical account into a meditation on the unknowable. It is in this tension between fact and speculation that the story retains its dark power. Even modern explorers and historians report a visceral reaction upon visiting the site. The farmhouse, now a dilapidated structure overgrown with ivy and moss, exudes an atmosphere of latent menace. The surrounding hills, with their fog and twisted trees, seem almost complicit in preserving the memory of fear. Researchers describe the experience as unsettling. The weight of history, the echoes of violence, and the persistence of myth coalesce into a palpable, haunting presence. In this way, the brothers' actions continue to influence perceptions, shaping both scholarly and popular understanding of crime, isolation, and folklore in 19th century America. Ultimately, the story of the Bender brothers serves as a meditation on human vulnerability, environmental influence, and the endurance of fear. It is a tale where history, psychology, and legend intertwine, illustrating how isolated landscapes can incubate cruelty, how society responds to terror, and how memory preserves both fact and fiction. The farmhouse, the hills, and the shadows cast by the brothers' actions remain as enduring symbols, reminders that evil can take root in the most unassuming places, and that the echoes of terror can resonate across time, shaping generations long after the perpetrators have vanished. In the quiet, mist-laden hills of the Missouri Ozarks, the past lingers, whispering of the brothers who served death to travelers, a dark reflection of the human capacity for horror and survival alike.